Greetings, everybody, and welcome here to Prog Monster. My name is Murph. I am the host of this show, a show dedicated to progressive rock and other forms of rock music. So we're back here on Saturday, late Saturday. I wanted to actually record this afternoon, but I had 1.5 million errands to run, and then I got really tired, so I decided I would take my nap and then go and do it. So that's what I'm doing. So anyways, we're doing metal. This is a show that I put on every 2 weeks, and I will continue to put it on every 2 weeks. It's not going to become a weekly show. There's a lot involved in this, and I'm still fairly new to the metal realm, at least to in-depth studies of the metal realm, I guess might be the better thing. I do have some metal background. I listened to metal when I was younger, but it's been a while, so I've been getting into it slowly, and I want to stick with the bi-weekly kind of show. Right now it's just going to do this Saturday night until I decide if I'm going to put it with another show, but lump them together and alternate them like I probably will, but not sure when or what that will be yet. So for now it will go every second Saturday. So we're doing Diamond Head today. So basically what metal is about is I kind of delve or dive further into the background, a little bit of the history of the band, their albums, the kind of music, how their music is going, all that kind of stuff, just to kind of be a little bit more in depth with their music than I am with, maybe some of the other shows. So this is more of a feature, I guess, you might want to call it. So we are featuring Diamond Head. So Diamond Head, for those of you who don't know, are what they would call one of the bands that came out during the new wave of heavy metal, so to speak. The most famous of these bands, of course, is Iron Maiden, and apparently Def Leppard falls into that category too. However, I'm not really seeing that, but that's fine. If they want to put them in there, that's okay with me. This band is, in my estimation, probably somewhere between the original kind of sound that Def Leppard had and what Iron Maiden has. So they're not as heavy as Iron Maiden, but not nearly as kind of hard rock metal sound that Def Leppard had originally. Okay, so just to give you a critique of where I think the band fits in. So they were founded in 1976 by Brian Tatler and Duncan Scott. They were friends. I'm guessing it was sometime in the middle grades in high school. That's basically what it was. While they were attending school. So while they were attending school, they tried to get this band going. Towards the end of that school year, they found a vocalist, Sean Harris, who became their lead vocalist. And then they also got after auditioning several people, they ended up settling for Colin Kimberly on the bass. So this was the band that formed Diamond Head and did their first album. So their history is fraught with a lot of issues, I guess you might want to call it. There was issues with getting a label. There was issues with management. There was issues with records. They're just unfortunate band. I think this band, if they had got the same kind of start as Def Leppard and the same kind of start as Iron Maiden, could have been a much bigger band than they ended up being, because their music is fantastic, I think. So, their early success included a date supporting both AC/DC for a show, and then right after that supporting Iron Maiden on a show as well. So already they were recognized by some of these big bands as having some talent. And they should have, they're maybe a little bit behind because of management and record label contracts that kind of set them back. They should have, since they were formed in 76, by 78, 79, they should have already been ready to go when that new wave of metal started, but it just didn't happen because of the circumstances. So they signed a contract with a to use a studio to record their album, and they didn't pay anything for the use of the studio. Instead, they signed a contract to give the guy 50%. His name was Muff Murfin. No relative, sorry. And the album that they put together was this Lighting the Nation. Now, it was difficult to find pieces of that album to listen to because they re-recorded that album in 2020, and that's all you get on the internet is the re-recorded album. You don't get the original. Well, you can get certain tracks. I found 3 or 4 tracks, and that's what I had to suffice with to listen to the album. So they finally made this deal with, this guy was getting 50%, and the other problem was that they had a couple of managers, but they were pushed out by Harris's mother and her boyfriend, who took over the band and managed it, and this probably wasn't a really good idea, so they were mismanaged, and then they couldn't find, and the problem was that, I think, based on what I've read, the problem was that his mother and the guy had this expectation that they were in the same league with Iron Maiden and Def Leppard and that, and they should get similar kind of contract, but they weren't getting those kind of contracts. They were getting offers for less, and they didn't want to sign because of that. So this I think was a huge setback for them. However, they did release the Lighting the Nation's album. The second album, which was the first on MCA. So what happened is that after this fiasco with the boyfriend and the mother and the independent label guy and all that, they did sign a contract with MCA Records, and their first 2 albums, which were what was the name of the albums? I can't even remember. Sorry, I'm on the wrong page, that's why. Borrowed Time, which I did do a review for on Ben's Album Challenge. That's where I discovered this band. And the other album was Canterbury, both released on the MCA labels. And they had signed a 5-album label record production with MCA, but I guess there was some, you had to do certain this or you did certain that in order to get to the 3rd album, and then they dropped them on the 3rd album, which is unfortunate because both albums did reasonably well. I think one of them had finished 24th on the UK charts. The other one I think was a little bit less than that, maybe 36 on the UK charts. But the problem was that when they did this second album, the record label sent them to a producer and a record studio to produce this album, and there was a huge amount of pressure put on them, and especially the drummer just wasn't measuring up, and he was under intense scrutiny, and eventually they removed him and kicked him out of the band. I don't know if it was the band that did. There was no indication of whether the band did it or the record label did it or the producer did it. Somebody kicked him out of the band, so he was out of there. My guess is he wasn't up to the level that the other members of the band were, and the record label wanted a drummer of that quality, so they ousted him. That's my guess, but it could be one of the other scenarios as well. I'm not really sure. As soon as the album was completed, the bass player also left the band, probably for the same reasons. Maybe he wasn't under as much scrutiny, but he finished his job, but he didn't want anything to do with it anymore. That's what it appears to be, and left the band. And the vocalist Harris, he also struggled. Sean Harris, he struggled with almost having a nervous breakdown because of the pressure that they had put on him, but he did stay with the band. The band kind of had a bit of that was kind of their first era, and they kind of drifted apart in '84 and went their separate ways. But then they came back together and tried again. And at this point in time, they released the Death and Progress album. This was on a different album, on a different label called Castle Music label. So, anyways, Harris didn't see eye to eye with the direction of the band, so he kind of eventually went his own way. Again, he had been doing his own stuff came back together after the producer tried to get them together again. They did do another album, and then they kind of went their own ways again. And the band then reformed many years later that was in the early 90s, this many years, like in the 2000s. About 8 years later, they reformed and had replaced Harris with Nick Tart, who was in the band for the new beginning of their 2000 plus era, and he stayed in the band, and then eventually he was replaced by another vocalist much later in the career. So they basically had 3 phases, I believe. The first phase was the inauguration of the band in '76, or the formation of the band, I guess, and then the end of the band, which ended in '84 with the 2 main guys, Sean Harris and Brian Tatler, going separate ways. Then they came back together and for the second formation in '90 to '94, doing the one album, but it didn't really work out the way they wanted, so they broke again apart. Then Tatler came back and reformed the band with his own people, and actually there was one guy left over from the second phase of the band who actually came back, and that was the drummer. So that's kind of a really brief overview of the band's history. And just to show you, like, they struggled with record labels and management and getting the albums out there, and still the stuff, if you listen to the stuff, it's really good. If they could have had the same kind of start as some of these bands are putting album after album out, I think they would have been much better. So anyway, so just talk briefly about the albums too. So they had, I think there was 9 albums in total, if I'm correct. Yes, there is. There's 9 albums in total. The first one under the independent label was called Lightning the Nation. I think that's what it was called. Lightning to the Nation. I didn't write the 2 in there. So this was had a lot of their original stuff, and was demos that they had sent out was added onto this album as well. This had a really raw sound to it. Not the best of production sounds. Heavy and catchy, but not. I don't think it was Iron Maiden heavy, but I think it was at least as heavy, or maybe heavier than Def Leppard at that time. And I would have said they were maybe more of a hard rock heavy metal band at this point in time, even though some people cite them. And they were major influences for bands like Metallica, who has covered quite a few of their tracks on their own albums. So the next album up was The Borrowed Time, which was the album that I entered into this, my Diamond Head history began with that album about, I don't know, it's probably over a year or so ago, when Ben gave me that album as a review album, and I listened to it. I thought, this is really good stuff, and the album cover on this is probably the best, I think the best, arguably the best cover of any of their albums. It was, they really went all out, the record label went all out, they got put them in the right place, made this big album cover, and had a great producer, but I think they put too much pressure on. These guys were still fairly young at this time, and it just had not a good effect on them. But the album itself is very good. There's also almost some progressive metal sound to this album. It's heavy, it's well put together, it sounds great. The vocals, guitars, and bass are all fantastic on this. I think beyond what I thought they would be. The album cover, of course, I already said, is great. It's a dragon with a like a dark entrance to a tunnel, and then there's a warrior standing on the edge of a cliff overlooking a desert, and it looks like it's an alien planet, but I could be wrong. So this was a very good album for me to come in at, and I think if I was to recommend coming in at on this band, this would be the album I would tell you to choose. Borrowed Time is the name of it. The next album up was called Canterbury. This was a little bit different. It still had some of that metal sound to it. Not as progressive sounding, I think. It did have progressive elements. Wasn't as progressive sounding as some of the stuff on that Borrowed Time. But they had a different drummer, Robbie Francis. And the bass player was Merlin Goldsworthy, but he did some of the bass, but I think the original bassist and another hired bassist did some work on this album as well. It's a little bit more poppy-like. It's a quieter album, not nearly as heavy as its predecessors, and a lot more commercial sounding, which I think really didn't sit well with their kind of fan base. Not that I think they had a huge fan base, but they must have had some fan base to get on some of the tours they got on. It's a little bit too pristine and a little bit too much commercial sounding, in my opinion, much better, more than Borrowed Time was. The next album up came out. This was the album on their second round. After they had broke up, they'd gone their own way. They came back together. At least Sean Harris and Brian Tatler came back together and did this album called Death and Progress. This was on a different label, Castle Music. A cleaner sounding album, much cleaner sounding album. Heavier, but still not a metal of the same type as they had on that original couple of albums. I think it was not really as metal as that. They did have a new drummer, Carl Wilcox, who is still with the band, and Pete Vukovich was on the bass, I believe. And it's a better produced album overall, though. The next album up, now they jumped out of that, and that was the end of their second era, and they jump into the third era. They had 5 albums in their third era, and I kind of think of that as divided in half. So half of them were with, the first couple were with Nick Tate on vocals, and then the last 3 were with Rasmus Bon Anderson on vocals. So there's kind of a split. Bon Anderson, more of a metal kind of traditional kind of speed metal type sounding vocalist to me. Maybe he's not, but he sounds that way to me. He looks the part too. Where the other guy, I think he was more of they looked for a guy who sounded almost exactly like Harris, and they put him on there. And I think there's a lot of similarity between their vocal styles. So their next 2 albums, which are All Will Be Revealed and What's in Your Head. So All Will Be Revealed, that was his debut, Tart's debut. They also had Eddie Mucan, who stays with the band for the rest of the way, and Adrian Mills on guitar. It's a very clear sounding, much heavier sounding album, I think, than its predecessor. I think Tart's vocals, while very similar to Harris, he had a bit more of a raspy voice, in my opinion, which I actually think suited their music better. I like him as a vocalist, very much so. The next album, What Is in Your Head? This may be the other album that I think has really good cover to the album. Maybe as good as Borrowed Time. They're both really good. Let's just put it that way. Andy Aberley, I think it's Aberley, joins them as rhythm guitarist. It's a very heavy album, another catchy album. Lots of really, they're maintaining their sound a little bit more on this. There's a little bit of a speed metal element to a couple of tracks on the album, but they're not dominant. So they basically have that original sound, which is good here, but cleaner. Then they did a self-titled album. This was the beginning of Rasmussen's tenure with the band. Rasmus Bon Anderson. He took over lead vocals. This is a pretty heavy album. Maybe up to this point, probably their heaviest album at that point in time. And very clear sounding. Lots of really heavy stuff on it. The next album, The Coffin Train. Now they're moving more. I don't know if the music is, but the definite overall sound, I think, maybe the sound, maybe the music too. The sound and the music and the image is more death, more of a dark feature to it, I think, than the other albums, any of the other albums. Very clear sounding, a lot faster pace, more of a speed metal sound to some of the tracks. But some really catchy sounds, and the vocalist I think he's stronger than the previous 2 vocalists, but different sounding in a lot of ways. Then you have the last album, which came out, the most recent album, which came out 2020, is actually just a revisit to their original album, Lightning to the nations. They re-recorded it with this band, with the technology now. It's a much cleaner sounding, heavier sounding, I think, and maybe a little faster paced as well, of their original studio album, which was recorded back when Harris's parents were in charge of, or his mother and her boyfriend were in charge of the management, and they were recording in that other studio by Muff Murphin. So yeah, so it's and it's also on Silver Lining, which their last 2 albums have been on. They did have one on Distance Productions, and then 2 on Cargo prior to that. So they've been on some different labels. The album covers are all pretty good. There's no real terrible covers in the grouping. The first album was originally put in a white cover and didn't even have a cover. That's how badly promoted it was. But overall, I find this band to be very good. They're well within the wheelhouse of music that I like. It's not so much speed metal. Maybe they are a little bit more now, and not so much death metal, although they are a little bit more of that now too. They definitely have that kind of Prey Mantis, Iron Maiden, Def Leppard realm, although I hate to use Def Leppard as a metal band because I just really don't think they are. But definitely they are in the realm with those bands. They have that same kind of sound to their music. And the guitar player is, of course, I think the best member of the band. Maybe not so much now because some of the other guys have come along. But overall, I really like this band, and I think that they deserve to be getting some attention. They didn't get the kind of start that bands like of their caliber should get, and so I think they deserve it, and I'm going to that's why I chose them to do metal this week. So for those of you who enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. It's much appreciated. Any comments about the group or anything I've said, please put them in the comments section below. And we will be doing metal again, probably every second Saturday from now until I decide where I think they fit in. I have an idea of where they're going to go, but that might be a while from now. I think that they will end up on a certain night, and it'll continue to be bi-weekly. There'll be probably another show put in with them. The only reason, like I said, the only reason that it's bi-weekly is because it takes a lot more to do this than it does to do like an album review or something like that. So when I have to do this, I have to really give it a lot of attention and not just 15 minutes and throw it together. This took me about 3 to 4 hours worth of different separate times to get this all down to where I felt comfortable enough to release a video and knew enough about the band that I wouldn't just be talking through my head, or my hat in this case. Anyways, I hope that you have a good evening, and we will see you in 2 weeks' time for metal. Take care.